So I'm finally getting around to making the video where I share my story. So I'll start at the beginning. Whenever I was little, my mother was a single mom, and she needed help with a new baby. So she went to a church. My mom was a Christian. She believed in Jesus, and she was heavily involved in her church. And also at the time, she lived in a state where she had no family. So she relied heavily on her church friends and some other friends that she had made at her job. So some people at the church that we were going to offered to watch me overnight sometimes so that she could have a break and so that I could play with their kids. Um, During that time, I started being molested by another family member that lived in the house. And I just also want to add to that I have completely forgiven these people. The person that abused me went through a lot of hardship himself, and he was also very young. So I just wanted to put it out there that I have completely forgiven them, and I know that everything happens for a reason. Um, I don't know how many times that I was abused, but I do know that it was more than just a handful. My mother started noticing behavioral changes in me, and when she found out what was going on, she wanted to take me and run. I was very young and I didn't understand what was happening to me or what was being done to me. I just knew that I had a lot of feelings and emotions that I didn't know how to deal with, and I knew that they made me not feel good. So as time went on, I began to hate myself. I didn't understand why, but I felt like trash. I felt like I was completely unworthy of any sort of love. I didn't want to be touched. Um, I just developed all kinds of issues. And around the age of 10, I got high for the first time. I had my first drink of alcohol, smoked my first cigarette, um, and I realized that these things made me feel different. I felt like I could numb the pain. I felt like it was an escape from what was going on in my head. At that time, I was dealing with horrible night terrors. I had a lot of stomach issues that I think was from anxiety. Um, I was just going through a lot of mental anguish and turmoil. I didn't know how to deal with anything. I just knew that I was angry and I was hurt and I was tired of being hurt. So the pain kind of switched more towards anger and hatred. I started getting involved in witchcraft, and I can attribute that to certain movies that me and my family members and friends watched. Um, a lot of times, stuff like that just goes unnoticed. It doesn't really affect the person that's watching it. I, however, was very impressionable, and I knew that I just wanted something different in my life. I didn't like who I was. I didn't like how my life was. I didn't understand why I didn't have a father. I didn't understand why the things happened to me that did happen to me. And I knew that there was a God because my mother did raise me in church. But I also felt like this God cannot love me the way that everyone says that he does and allow me to go through the things that I went through. That was my thought process at the time. So I got into witchcraft. Um, I started learning how to do spell casting. I learned about astral projection. I learned about telekinesis. Uh, Anything that you can think of that goes directly against God, I started dabbling in. I played with Ouija boards. I started trying to contact the dead. And it was around that time, I was like 12. I think I was in the 8th grade. I tried to hang myself. Um, I hated myself. I hated everybody around me. I just felt like I did not belong here, and everything in me just wanted to go. I didn't want to be here anymore. So, in the basement of the house that we were living in, I tried to take my life. And it was unsuccessful, and that just made everything worse. So, a few months after that, I tried to take my life by taking a bunch of pills, which all that did was make me sick, and made my mother worry about me. During all of this, my mother never gave up on me. I put her through hell. I was mean to her. I did everything I could to show her that I did not want her to love me. I wanted her to leave me alone and let me wallow in my own misery. But she never stopped praying for me, and she never gave up on me. About a year later, around the age of 13, is when I started getting into abusive relationships. And I know now that the reason why I went after the men that I did was because I had no sense of self-worth. I had no self-esteem. Looking back, I understand why God created marriage to be between one man and one woman, and they are supposed to be together for the rest of their lives. That all makes sense now, because when you go from abusive relationship to abusive relationship, it just complicates things and it causes a lot more pain and suffering and heartache that you wouldn't have if you just waited until you found the person that God had for you. During the abusive relationships from the age of 13 all the way up until I hit my 20s, I was raped, beaten, I was gaslighted. All of these things that I dealt with that I wouldn't have had to deal with if I just knew what I was worth. But in the middle of all that, I got fed up with life again, and I got on my knees and I prayed, but I did not pray to God. I prayed to the devil. I completely renounced God. Not that I was a Christian at the time anyway, but I was brought up in church, so I knew who God was. But I renounced God. I cried out to Satan, and I said, God cannot help me. If he can't help me, maybe you can. And I asked Satan to come into my life. I basically pledged my allegiance to the devil. And from that point on, I turned into a completely different person. The anger that was in me greatly intensified. I had a newfound hatred for every single human being on the face of the planet, including myself. And when you decide to follow Satan, he promises you the world. The exact same way that Jesus was tempted by Satan in the Bible, he makes you feel like you're invincible. He promises you popularity. He promises you all of the things that your flesh could ever want. And that directly goes against what God wants for us. That goes against what God has promised us. But at the time when you're that broken and desperate and you don't know who God really is, you're willing to do anything. So I spent the next few years just not a good person. I was a thief, I was a liar, I was a cheater, and I had no conscience. I could have hurt someone and not cared. When I was in my early 20s, I was dating a guy. It was a new relationship, and we partied all the time. We always had a ton of people at the house. And in the middle of the night, there was a whole bunch of people over, and I noticed that I was getting really nauseous from trying to smoke a cigarette. Something told me to go take a pregnancy test, so I did. And my jaw hit the floor whenever I read the results. I had a life in me. And at that moment, everything was put into perspective for me, that I was not a good person to be a mother. And in that moment, I knew that I was going to do everything in my power to make sure that that baby, that life in me, would never go through the same things that I had went through. So from that moment on, I never touched another drop of alcohol. I never got high again. I tried to do all the things that I knew to do in my power to make myself good, to make myself a good mom. So I had a little girl. About 4.5 years later, I had another little girl. I still felt like I wasn't right. I still dealt with anxiety and depression, self-hatred. I still felt like I could be a better mother for my kids. So I decided to put myself into trauma therapy, which was very hard because I had been running from the things that I had been through my whole life. I was driving one day to a therapy appointment. It was early on in therapy. I think it was probably like my second or third appointment. And as soon as I parked in the parking lot, I had this feeling come over me that I will never forget, and I heard a voice, and the voice called me daughter. He said, "Daughter, what are you doing?" And in that moment, it doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter if you're a Satanist like I had become. It doesn't matter if you are an atheist and you believe in absolutely nothing. When you hear a voice that created the heavens and the earth and knew you before you were formed in your mother's womb, you know exactly who it is. And all of the wrong that I had done, all of the terrible things that I had thought that I had actually done, the creator of the universe still called me daughter. And he asked me what was I doing. And I immediately started crying and I said, "Lord, I don't know, but I'm broken." I then had a vision of a forked road in front of me. One path was very small and there was nobody else on it. It didn't look very inviting. As a matter of fact, it looked kind of scary. And then there was another path that was wide. Many people were on it. It was full of bright, beautiful colors, and it looked like the way to go. But even in my very little knowledge of Christ, I knew that the wide path was not the one that we were supposed to be on. In that moment in my car, in my therapist's parking lot, I gave my life to Christ. And the moment that I did that, I could see clearly. He removed, I don't know what else to call them other than blinders, off of my eyes. And for a moment, he allowed me to see myself and the rest of humanity the way that God sees us. God doesn't see you the way that you see you. God sees through your pain, he sees through your sin, he sees through your brokenness, and he sees you for who you really are, who he called you to be. So, I walked into my therapist's office after I pulled myself together, and I could not stop smiling, which, if you knew me before, smiling is something that I never did, and I was always told that I need to smile more. My therapist looked at me and she got a funny look on her face and she said, "Something is different about you. What's going on?" And I felt weird and embarrassed because of what had just happened out in the parking lot, but I said, "I don't know what your beliefs are as far as if you believe in God or things like that, but God just spoke to me in my car, and I think I just got saved." She broke into tears. And she said, "Jenny, I am a Christian counselor. I just can't tell people that unless they specifically ask for Christian therapy." In that moment, I knew that I was absolutely making the right decision with giving my life to Christ, because before I even said yes to him, he had put a woman in my path that could help me with all of my issues from a Christian standpoint, not a worldly one. From that moment on, the chains just broke off of me. I still have things that I struggle with, but that's the life that we live in because we live in a fallen, broken world. However, the chains that used to have me in bondage, like anxiety, depression, hatred, just being completely blind to what the actual truth is. God broke all of those things off of me. There's a lot more to my story, but for the sake of time, I needed to give y'all a condensed version, but I am going to be posting more videos just to go into detail about certain parts of my life, about dreams that I've had, about miracles I've witnessed, about things that God has told me. And I just want to encourage you, whether you know Christ or you don't know Christ right now, please don't give up hope. And if you don't know Christ, I can promise you, nobody told me to be the way that I am now. If you knew me before, you would know that I am too stubborn to listen to anything that anybody says to me. But I can promise you beyond a shadow of a doubt, God is real, the Bible is real, all of that stuff is real. And no matter what your beliefs are, I urge you, give God a shot. Don't discredit him because of what the world thinks of you or because people might laugh at you. At the end of the day, I would rather stand before God and be judged by the world than to live for the world and be judged by God. It's as simple as that. It doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. Thank you guys for listening. God bless you, and I will talk to you soon.